Good evening, Yat everyone. Thank you, Neak. Greetings and thank you all for joining us on this beautiful evening to kick off this teach-in series titled Native Perspectives on Public Lands and Tribal Preservation. We are excited to have so many amazing panelists lined up for the next few weeks. Please allow me to introduce myself. She'eya Talia Boyd and She, Torich Eatney and Shle, Toy Haglini Bushichin, Ashidashiche do Tobahadashanale. I am Talia Boyd. I come from the Bitterwater clan, born for water flows together. My maternal grandfather is Red Bottom, and my paternal grandfather is Water's Edge. I was born and raised on the Navajo Nation, and I am also the Cultural Landscapes Program Manager for the Grand Canyon Trust. Excuse me. I am also pleased to have Neak Loucks with us this evening, the Education Program Manager for the Grand Staircase-Escalante Partners, who will be co-presenting with me this evening. We will begin by introducing our organizations, and then Neak is going to jump into her presentation on a brief history of conservation and the Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument. And I will follow up with a brief history of the Native-led work around Bears Ears. So without further ado, let's begin.
So real quick, the session is being recorded and a link of the recording is going to be shared on our website. The session is also being streamed on Facebook Live on our event page. So if you want to share with folks as we get started here, you're welcome to do that. Just so you know, all attendees are on mute and we can't see your videos, so feel free to move about as needed. Don't worry about background noise on your end. You can submit questions throughout this teach-in using the Q&A function. I'll explain how to use that in just a minute. We are going to save those questions to use in the panels throughout the next couple weeks. So you can register for those following teach-ins at this link. We'll talk more about that at the end. And it is only one registration link for the next 4 panels. So to use the Q&A box, all you need to do is mouse down to the bottom of your screen. You should see an icon, has little chat bubbles, and it says Q&A. If you click on that, it's going to open a box that you can submit questions into. If you have any logistical issues, you can also drop questions in, and then we will save those. We're not sure if we're going to have time for questions at the end of this session, but we will definitely save those questions for our panelists who are more suited for answering those questions. So I'm going to turn it back to Talia.
Thank you, Neak. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the Grand Canyon Trust. The Grand Canyon Trust was founded in 1985 with the mission to safeguard the wonders of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau while supporting the rights of its Native peoples. For more than 3 decades, the Grand Canyon Trust has been a leading conservation organization in the region, working to protect the Colorado Plateau. A core part of our Cultural Landscapes program is supporting and learning from tribal communities and leaders. We recognize that all lands are ancestral Native peoples' lands, and we strive to walk a path of re-indigenizing the management of so-called public lands with the mission to change the paradigm of public lands management and by making space for Native knowledge and perspectives. We are working with tribes and allies to elevate the voices of tribal communities for the protection of cultural landscapes and to authentically support the rights of Native peoples.
Sorry, I was muted. It's not a Zoom meeting until someone says, oops, I was muted. So Grand Staircase-Escalante Partners was founded in 2004 as the original friends group of Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument. Our mission is to honor the past and safeguard the future of Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument through science, conservation, and education. We carry out restoration, monitoring, and other stewardship-focused projects, advocate for land management policies that support ecosystem health and biodiversity of this region, and provide adult and youth education through both virtual and, in usual times, in-person events and activities. I and my fellow staff members are happy to talk about the work we do in more detail with anyone who reaches out. For this evening, I want to jump right into our material. I'm getting some messages in the chat that there might be a little bit of an echo. I'm not sure what is causing it, so apologies for the audio. Hopefully it's still understandable. So conservation. What are the ideas, images, and narratives that come to mind when you hear and use the word conservation? Feel free to chat some of your thoughts, or to type some of your thoughts into the chat box, which can be found by clicking on the chat icon on the bottom menu bar on your screen. And you can do the same for the word preservation. So we may think of conserving resources such as water, helping to maintain ecosystem health, and preventing plant and animal extinctions, and so on. I see mutually sustained, wise use of natural resources. Historical removal of native communities from traditional lands. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Thank you. Consideration of natural resources, ecosystem resilience and integrity, protecting what is sacred, land, water, and all related creatures, preserve, to protect for longer duration. I also want to ask the question, who is a conservationist? Or a slight variation on that, who comes to mind when you think of conservationists? Again, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box. I see everyone should be a conservationist, Aldo Leopold, tribal communities, everyone can be both, Rachel Carson, Gifford Pinchot, some of these big names here. Wildlife watchers, ranchers, native people, recreationists, anyone who cares about where they live. Great. Historical environmental organizations, anyone who wants to and can learn to be. So many options come flowing in here. So this short exercise is one starting point for starting to see some of the assumptions built into the dominant ideas held about conservation and preservation. For instance, there are certain ideas about the involvement of humans in conservation and preservation efforts, as shown in this diagram here, that's seeking to represent the differences between the two and in terms of human involvement. And then there are even some definitions point to the cultural underpinnings of these ideas. For instance, in this definition here, proper use of nature. Anytime we see a word like proper, we know some kind of value judgment from a particular cultural and political perspective is being made. We can also see from what folks dropped into the chat that we don't all have the same view or same relationships to conservation. Though the historical narrative I'll be walking through this evening is speaking specifically in response to dominant threads of white conservation and preservation movements, I want to acknowledge that those of you who have joined us tonight come from many different perspectives and varying levels of prior knowledge on these topics. Related to the notion that there are many vantage points on this topic, I'll also note before we dive in that assembling a look into the past for this event required including some details and not others, simply to fit into the time we have scheduled. So there are many resources for digging deeper, which we can share in follow-up emails. And also the chat box is open for anyone who wants to share links or any additional information to cover details that we aren't able to cover here this evening. I'm also going to make one more note. You'll likely notice some slippage in my narrative between conservation and preservation. I recognize that these are typically understood to be distinct concepts, but their origins are rooted in parallel and often overlapping trajectories. So for the purposes of this evening's teach-in, I'm primarily going to follow one historical arc without digging into some of the distinctions that are usually made between the two. So back to this notion of conservation. Conservation includes a valuable notion of making decisions about resource use and land management that considers collectives over individuals and with longer-term futures in mind. However, for too long, conservation in the United States has been focused on an understanding of nature as being separate from humans, and has highlighted and revered leaders of the conservation and preservation movements, mostly white men, who have called for and perpetuated exclusionary practices in the name of conserving spaces. Conservation practices that don't take into account perspectives and philosophies from Black and Indigenous people of color have dominated the scene in ways that are demeaning and harmful to marginalized communities and individuals. So here I've included a few images showing a broader conceptualization of what conservation is and who is involved. Today, we're going to share with you some facets of the history of American conservation and preservation in order to broaden the frame, to include the realities of what has taken place with regard to land and land management in the US, including the public lands that we love so dearly. This introductory portion of our teaching series is meant to begin creating a space where we can acknowledge the less told aspects of the history of conservation in the US and recognize the damage that has been done in order that we might become more able to move forward, ready to listen, ready to support perspectives that have too frequently been excluded, and ready to partake in envisioning ways of caring for land that are not limited to dominant narratives of conservation that center white voices and colonial practices. Today's topic sets the stage for engaging in this journey. So to get a clear picture of American conservation, we have to start from well before the time period in which conservation ideals became a driving force in land use and management decisions. Prior to the arrival of Western colonizers, this continent was home to myriad native nations, including on the Colorado Plateau, where contemporary tribes trace their presence in this region back to time immemorial. A key point here is that this was not empty space, which is implied by the notion of the frontier. This is another visualization of native inhabitants or tribal territories. And of course, representing something that spans both time and space on a two-dimensional map is tricky. And maps themselves can be somewhat colonial in nature in the way that they represent territory. But this does show the preponderance of native residents and land use. And these visualizations demonstrate a key point that contrary to European colonizer discourse and American expansion discourse, this was never empty space. I'll also note briefly here that this colonization also had a significant impact on the landscapes themselves. So this figure shows the change in old growth forest through centuries of colonization, alongside how native populations were forced into smaller and smaller areas over time. The impact of colonization in the Americas was violent and devastating. As many of you have likely learned, European colonizers carried diseases to which communities in the Americas had no immunity. But disease was hardly the only force at play. Explorers and colonizers carried out purposeful actions of genocide and dispossession. Colonizing countries' policies regarding colonization were quite literally dehumanizing in order to justify violence, seizure of land, and more. One key example of this is the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was established through a series of papal bulls, which are official proclamations issued by a pope, issued in 1452, 1493, and beyond, that claimed to justify Christian European colonizers' pursuits of claiming land and waterways. The decree said that if an explorer proclaims to have discovered land in the name of a Christian European monarch, plants a flag, reports it to his European rulers, and returns to occupy it, the land would now be his, even if others were already living there. By this doctrine, European colonizers were also permitted to declare the original inhabitants' way of being on the land inadequate according to European standards. And this was an ideology that supported dispossession, murder, and forced assimilation. The doctrine was a tool of white supremacy, supporting white European claims that they possessed cultural superiority and were instruments of divine design. If your ancestors were negatively affected by this doctrine, you might have already known about it. If your ancestors were not negatively affected, and perhaps even gained advantage from this policy, did you learn about this in school? Did you learn about this from your family? Take a moment to reflect on who has the privilege to not know about this impactful aspect of colonization. The doctrine of discovery was set forth in the 1400s, so you might think its relevance had decreased by the time the United States was becoming an established nation. On the contrary, although at times the issue was raised of what right Europeans had to come take land and life away from indigenous inhabitants, the idea of the doctrine ran largely unchecked. The doctrine was not only a precursor to the concept of manifest destiny, which we'll discuss in a minute, but it was also essentially codified in U.S. federal law in 1823, when the Supreme Court used the historical precedents of the doctrine of discovery to rule that Native tribes had no right to title over land, because discovery gave European nations sovereignty and title over that land. The ruling stated that the principle of discovery gives European nations an absolute right to New World lands, while giving Native peoples only certain rights of occupancy. This history demonstrates that the legal systems of European countries, and later the United States, had almost no recognition of and no respect for indigenous lifeways. In the United States, westward expansion was supported by an idea similar to the doctrine, that cast white colonizers as divine instruments fulfilling a destiny laid out by God. This idea is known as manifest destiny, a cultural belief widely held and wielded during the 1800s, though it was not coined by that term until 1845. This ideology had three main components: a belief that American people, referring to white settlers, and their institutions had special virtues, essentially a sense of cultural and racial superiority; a mission to tame the western part of the continent to make it be an idealized Euro-American agrarian society; and a belief that such expansion of white settlements and national borders was inevitable because it was ordained by God. Through both the 1823 Johnson versus Mintosh case and the ideology of manifest destiny, we see how the Catholic concept of discovery, as laid out in the papal bulls, was adopted and morphed into ideologies that supported a Protestant nation-building project. This period of colonizing the interior of the continent can be described with the term settler colonialism. Colonization, not just through establishing government outposts, but through non-Indigenous people moving into areas and laying claim to them. There were numerous legislative acts during this period of colonizing the West that facilitated this, such as the Homestead Acts of the 1860s, which provided land to white men, provided they farmed the land for a certain period of time. Once again, creating policy that privileged Anglo-European settlers and treated land and landscapes as there for the taking. Another aspect of settler colonialism is the assignment of new meaning to places, as if they were a blank slate, refusing to acknowledge the meaning and relationships with land that already exist in that space. During this period of settler colonial expansion, white settlers' dominant interpretation of nature was quite different from the ideals held in the conservation field today. Colonial views framed nature as something to be conquered and exploited for resources. And to those moving westward across challenging terrain and with little knowledge of the areas through which they were traveling, there was nothing romantic about the nature they faced. The use of the term wilderness or wildness was not to connote an area with special positive value, but rather held a negative connotation of distaste and fear, a symbol of paganry and chaos opposite a Christian civilization, as darkness opposite the light of civilization, as something to be avoided or something to be transformed into the worked agricultural land, or into the tidy European ideal of manicured gardens. As historian Roger Nash has written, Western civilization invented wilderness. It is Judeo-Christian / Anglo-European thought that divides the world into binary categories of wild and tame, natural and cultivated. Through this period of expansion, wilderness was considered desolate, hideous, and terrible, and was associated with confusion, wickedness, and suffering. However, with the rise of industrialism, there were a number of shifts in white settlers' perceptions of nature. From the conservation side were growing concerns about managing natural resources for long-term use. Additionally, for some, especially urban elites who had adopted strains of thought from German Romanticism, which is a topic for another lecture, nature, and especially wild nature, began to be seen in a more positive light. While still maintaining the binary of wild versus civilized spaces, these white and mostly wealthy urban residents sought natural spaces to escape the din of urban industrialism. Natural or wild spaces were seen as, in the words of ecological philosopher Max Olschlager, an oasis free of the ills of civilization, a retreat to which the harried and battered, the suppressed or oppressed might turn for relief. However, in practice, this notion of rejuvenating escape to nature was not envisioned for all, especially not for the truly suppressed and oppressed. Embedded within this desire among urban middle and upper classes to get away from the dirtiness of cities was a thread of racism toward rising immigrant populations in urban centers. So there were tensions between conservationist and preservationist lines of thought during this time, but both ultimately focused on nature as separate from culture and on land as spaces for white people and for men. From the late 19th century, the number of vocal advocates grew for various versions of conservation and preservation, but the views expressed were wholly centered in Euro-American worldviews of land and nature and were imbued with an ideal of white purity in natural and wild spaces. These developing understandings of natural spaces as something to be conserved or protected, and of wildness having positive value, typically had one of two harmful interpretations of the role of Native peoples in these spaces. In one version, Native inhabitants were cast as part of the natural environment. As you recall, in a worldview in which humans and nature are set at opposite conceptual poles, such a move continued the long tradition of dehumanizing non-white, non-European communities. And one example of this configuration is George Catlin's 1830s conceptualization of a national park that included Native inhabitants. In another version, non-white, non-European cultural beliefs and practices were denigrated, casting Indigenous presence as a scourge on the land and ignoring the complex, intimate, and multi-generational knowledge these communities had and still have about the environments around them. This latter view gained popularity as westward expansion accelerated, likely due to tensions over land, and is embedded in John Muir's notion of uninhabited wilderness that is a prevailing view today. And here I included a quote from the Wilderness Act, which is occurred much later than the time period we're discussing here. But I do think it's a good example of the ways that this idea of uninhabited natural space, uninhabited wilderness, has become codified, embodied in law. Aside from racist views of human difference that denied dignity to non-white inhabitants, these views also denied the very real and tangible ways in which Native communities were already shaping and managing landscapes built from generations of intimate engagement with these spaces and ecosystems. One example of this is how, in many instances across the continent, communities have used purposeful burning to help culturally relevant plants and animals thrive and to support the overall well-being of the ecosystems. Today, we are seeing some of the impacts of the interruption of those practices in the form of fires fueled by dangerous fuel loads. And so, at the turn of the century, a number of actions began to incorporate some of these conservation ideals into legal structures. There was the creation of national parks, Yellowstone in 1872, Sequoia and Yosemite in 1890, Mount Rainier in 1899, and several others over the course of the first 15 years of the 1900s. Additionally, there was the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 that gave executive power to set aside forest reserves, the Carey Act of 1894 that transferred federal land to states specifically for the purpose of protecting it, the 1905 creation of the National Forest Service, the 1906 signing of the Antiquities Act, which gave executive power to create special protections for areas of scientific and cultural interest, and the 1911 Weeks Act, which permitted the federal government to purchase private land to put in reserve to protect watersheds and waterways. And this is largely how the public lands in the eastern part of the U.S. were created through the purchasing of private lands after the passing of the Weeks Act. These were the early legal structures that contributed to the American public land system developing into what we know today. And in that sense, they contributed to preventing privatization and development in areas that are now celebrated for their beauty, biodiversity, and more. However, as you know from the narrative thus far, these spaces weren't empty wilderness. In the context of preserving spaces for Americans' enjoyment, a kind of nature set aside from human inhabitants was built through policy and in some cases military action. Take, for instance, those early national parks. In order to create these pristine spaces that met the ideals of romantic nature, folks seeking respite would have to change the landscapes. Essentially, they would have to produce wilderness. The setting aside of land for national parks has been called America's best idea. These parks have helped raise people's awareness about public lands. But what many people don't learn when they visit these parks is that in numerous cases, including Yosemite, Glacier, and Yellowstone, Native communities were forcibly removed to create the impression of natural uninhabited space. And existing treaty rights to hunting and plant gathering were violated. Though as a side note, in recent years, some tribes have regained some of these treaty rights through lawsuits in the US judicial system. In many of these instances, arguments were made that these areas had not been used by Native Americans and that therefore no removal was taking place. Government representatives argued in multiple areas that Native people didn't use the area due to superstitions, fear, or awe about such features as the geothermal aspects of Yellowstone and the canyons of what is now Zion National Park. However, this was all despite evidence to the contrary, running counter to both Native articulations of territory and use and also archaeological evidence. As Isaac Canfor has pointed out in his article, Ethnic Cleansing and America's Creation of National Parks, all national parks are on Native land, and each instance of dispossession is unique. Taken collectively, these instances include the use of military force, denial of treaty rights and the use of force to enforce that denial, deceitful cessation documents that implied the land would be returned, coercive land trades, as was the case with Mesa Verde, and unfavorable rulings in the US court system influenced by the same anti-Indigenous ideologies driving dispossession in the first place. Of course, there are many other forms of public lands with varying modes of management, some of which are less restrictive about use, but in many cases, Native treaty rights have been devalued and dismissed. I do want to point out that there are now a number of legal structures in place to help protect Native interests. For example, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 requires that federal agencies consult and coordinate with tribes regarding the impact of proposed agency decisions on federal land, so how those might affect tribal land, resources, or areas of cultural or historic interest. Consultation with tribes is also a part of the NEPA process, that's the National Environmental Policy Act. And then there's the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, which is an important human rights legislation creating consulting requirements about the excavation of human remains, funerary objects, and cultural patrimony, which are items owned by a whole tribe. It's meant to facilitate the inventory and repatriation of human remains held by the federal government and by institutions receiving federal funding. And there, excuse me, there have been some recent successes regarding repatriation among tribes on the Colorado Plateau, but it's also important to remember that the rightful return of and respect for remains is an ongoing process and an ongoing fight. There's also the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, which protects the rights of Native Americans to exercise their traditional religions by ensuring access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through traditional ceremonies and rites. However, such policies existing now do not undo the legacy of earlier approaches. And dominant cultural and political practices have a long way to go toward repairing damages done and towards effective inclusion of Native nations in land management processes. There have been a number of big wins, such as the inclusion of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition in the formal management structure of Bears Ears National Monument, the regaining of treaty rights to land use, as I mentioned earlier, and the recent Supreme Court ruling that nearly half of Oklahoma remains Indian country for the purposes of federal criminal law. But I do want to note here that these are all within the settler legal system, which highlights the prevailing power held by white settlers. Laws and policies greatly impact how things play out on the ground. And even the notion of who can participate in shaping those laws and policies has long been anti-Indigenous. For instance, Native Americans were not granted American citizenship until 1924, and not granted the right to vote in Utah until 1957. We also know from contemporary examples that federally required consultation does not necessarily result in truly hearing and respecting Native interests, as we saw in the case of Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline. Well, in this presentation, I'm focusing on the trajectory of white-dominated conceptualizations and actions in conservation and preservation. I think it's important to remind ourselves, too, of the Native-led resistance and activism that has continued through all the periods described thus far, both operating within the US legal system and beyond it. So as we shift to focus on the Colorado Plateau, I just want to return to the importance of decentering dominant narratives about conservation in order to support more just approaches to land management. Even with these additional legal structures and recent wins, both within the legal system and in the form of increased awareness about the intersection of Native rights and public lands, many ways that white people have engaged in conservation, preservation, and public lands protection still fail to recognize tribal sovereignty, non-Western understandings of the environment, and the Indigenous knowledge and relations that arise from the fact that the land about which we're making management decisions is Native land and is ancestral land. So I'm going to shift to share just a little bit about Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument. It was designated in 1996 by President Bill Clinton, whereas previous national monuments had focused on protecting specific sites or landmarks. This monument was designated with an understanding of objects of scientific, cultural, and historic interest existing on a landscape scale. Rather than seeking to protect one particularly charismatic geologic feature or one historical building, this monument was designed with a bigger picture about managing and studying landscapes in mind. GSE&M was also the first national monument to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which certainly has shaped what kind of management approaches were considered and used. Whereas the National Park Service is specifically focused on interpretation for visitors, the BLM is charged with managing for multiple use and is expected to make decisions for the highest and best use. But what is considered the highest and best use is, of course, cultural, just like when there was the definition about conservation referring to proper use. And given that, and the fact that some uses have direct or indirect negative impacts on other uses, you can see what a challenging management position that is. The dominant story told about the monument and its creation is one of science. The monument is indeed rich with scientific research opportunities, but I do find it interesting that this narrative dominates all others. While looking into some oral history archives related to the monument, I learned that Native representatives came together in Capitol Reef prior to the monument designation to discuss with federal agency employees what areas in the region were significant to their tribes and to discuss the possibility of a national monument and which lands might be important to include for added protections. I hadn't heard this before, and I'm actually still trying to learn more about how that input was included or how it was or wasn't incorporated into the monument and into the ideas for the original resource management plan. And I recognize that my not knowing is definitely a result of my own blind spots, but I think it also shows how much work remains to sort of the uncertainty or the difficulty in finding out more information about that shows how much work remains to create space for multiple narratives about what Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument is. I know that I and Grand Staircase-Escalante partners as a whole are still learning about the ways that the Grand Staircase-Escalante region is experienced and valued by tribes and Native individuals, and what perspectives tribes have towards the monument designation and its management. Although there are federal rules around consulting with tribes, we recognize that there can and should be more and more effective inclusion of tribes' perspectives when it comes to land management in this region. So now I'm going to turn it over to Talia, who will discuss Bears Ears and Native-led land management.
Thank you, Neak. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And we don't often hear about the unspoken dark nuances in histories within conservation. And I often say that the conservation movement was built on privilege, power, and oppression. Because since its inception, it has recognized the land, but not the native peoples that come with the land. And so now let's segue into the native-led work around Bears Ears. It's important for us to understand that Grand Staircase and Bears Ears are different in terms of their process and creation and land management planning. Grand Staircase does not have the same kind of structure as Bears Ears. It includes co-management with tribes. Bears Ears was the first national monument designated at their direct request of sovereign Native nations, where previous national monuments have been championed primarily by white conservationists. The Bears Ears model is a solid example for tribes to lead these initiatives and dialogues, because our identities and livelihood as Native peoples is interwoven with the landscape. It is a way for us to restore the balance within ourselves and with the natural world for next generations. Public lands are ancestral lands. This is what Indigenous people know. This is what we say. And what is a cultural landscape? For Native peoples, it is all of Turtle Island. All of our traditional homelands is a cultural landscape and is considered sacred. Bears Ears has always been special to Native peoples throughout the Colorado Plateau and beyond. It represents one of many unique landscapes where we can honor the teachings and lifeways of our ancestors to pass on to future generations. It is part of an ancient system of sacred spaces meant for healing. It is significant for many reasons for many tribes, everything from gathering medicine, stones, crystals, herbs, plants, water, food to hunt and gather, wood gathering, ceremony, ancient structures, burial grounds, and what I call real history, rock history, or petroglyphs. We Native peoples know we have an inherent responsibility to the natural world and for future generations. Our traditional knowledge systems are deep-rooted and are instilled through regenerative relationships with the natural world that have existed since the beginning, as taught through our cosmologies and our epistemologies. These traditional knowledge systems have been passed down through blood memory and oral history. The interconnectedness shared between the landscape and Native peoples has never been teased apart and is still recognized today through our very identities and lifeways, through our languages and our ceremonies. This land is Native land. It does not recognize the English language. English is foreign and cannot heal and restore what has been desecrated and destroyed without Native peoples who know how to speak to the land and provide offering and prayers in return for all the life-giving elements from the natural world. It is an unwavering acknowledgement of what you take and what you give back. It is a balance that requires discipline. It is a deep respect. Respect for all life, respect for our elders, our children, our communities, our ancestors, our four-legged and winged relatives, all of our relations, respect for our future together. For years, this delicate landscape has been desecrated by belligerent looting and vandalism, including reckless recreation and the prospecting of uranium. Indigenous communities are often on the front lines of defending our territories, our sacred landscapes, our resources, and our rights from extractive projects and corporate and outside interests. This is only a small piece and glimpse of the brunt Native people's experience in a massive exploitive system built against us. We have dealt with governmental entities like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who manages energy development on 55 million surface acres held in trust or restricted status for tribes and their members. BIA has been notorious for having issues with oversight and collaborating with stakeholders. And let's be real, tribes get lumped into that stakeholder category all the time. And we are not mere stakeholders, we are sovereign nations. There are also issues with workforce planning, equipment, infrastructure, and data use. When President Obama designated Bears Ears in December 2016, protection for this region was long overdue. Monument protection for Southeast Utah had been considered since the 1930s. But it took the coordination, persistence, and the sovereign status of 5 Native nations to ultimately gain the protection of 1.35 million acres of ancestral homelands. Less than a year later, Trump ignored the overwhelming public support for Bears Ears and slashed the monument by 85%. The original boundaries encompasses some of the Southwest tribe's finest cultural resources, as well as very fragile sacred spaces. It is now fragmented into 2 units. The shrunken boundaries leave more than 1 million acres of previously protected land vulnerable to uranium prospecting and irresponsible recreation. Trump's proclamations are a profound display of disrespect towards Native peoples, and we believe he lacks the authority under the Antiquities Act to unravel our national monuments. Following the 5 tribes, the Grand Canyon Trust is challenging his reductions in court alongside other conservation groups and outdoor businesses. We are committed to restoring Bears Ears National Monument to the original boundaries. In 2015, the Hopi, Navajo, Ute Mountain Ute, and Zuni nations set aside many disagreements and unified as the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition to petition the Obama administration to protect Bears Ears. They came together with the purpose of collaborating to permanently protect and promote sacred, spiritual, natural, scientific, and cultural resources within the Bears Ears cultural landscape. Their efforts are supported by more than 250 tribes across America. The coalition's successful proposal marks the first Native-driven national monument campaign in history. This kind of tribal unity creates space for what other tribal nations may envision for protecting ancestral homeland. There are many examples of tribes working together to restore and implement traditional knowledge practices. For instance, the Northern California and Woodland tribes, who are currently fighting wildfires with controlled burns, the Columbian River Intertribal Fish Commission, the intertribal buffalo exchanges that are currently happening, and coastal tribes restoring clam farms. We also have our southern relatives, our Amazonian tribal matriarchs protecting their rainforests. For Native peoples, the lines that we see on maps are irrelevant, and we do not recognize them. They are discordant, like reservation boundaries. It is artificial and serves to disconnect Native peoples from our homelands. Indigenous thinking is nonlinear and recognizes universal interconnectedness. The timeless connections to our traditional homelands has never been stripped away from Native peoples, even through genocide and colonization. As a way to show this to others, the coalition leaders remove state lines to highlight those divisions. When viewed in this way, others may see Bears Ears as a part of a connected landscape. The trauma of land loss hits deep for all tribal communities. Why do natives look so good in black? Well, it's because we're still mourning the loss of our land. The tribal homelands around Bears Ears have long been targeted by pot hunters and grave robbers. For decades, natives have worked hard to protect Bears Ears to prevent looting and irresponsible recreation. The desecration of cultural sites When our ancestors' remains are tampered with and sacred spaces and shrines and objects are desecrated, it has a direct impact on the psyche of Native peoples. It compromises the wholeness to heal. And it doesn't just impact Native peoples, it also impacts those who choose to steal and disrespect our ancestors and sacred spaces, and it's not in a good way. One thing Natives know how to do is survive. We have been working hard to heal and rebuild connections to our traditional knowledge systems and homelands through our languages and our ceremonies. We know what our responsibilities are as the original stewards of this land. And so for many tribal leaders and for many years, they worked hard planting seeds in the minds and hearts of people by intentionally willing to have hard conversations to mend past tensions and to carve out space in important places to start leading. And in 2015, as a result of tribes organizing amongst themselves for years, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition proposed the 1.9 million acre national monument for Bears Ears, with robust federal and intertribal collaborative management. A year later, President Obama designated the 1.35 million acre monument with the strongest collaborative management model in American law to date. Bears Ears National Monument set the stage for an era in public lands management, which incorporates real and meaningful input from Native peoples. The proclamation laid out the intent to implement collaborative management with a tribal commission to work alongside federal agencies to manage the new monument and incorporate both Native traditional knowledge and Western science. This was a huge victory for so many who sacrificed years of organizing to make this happen. And for the tribes, the designation also affirmed tribal sovereignty and provided space to work with the federal government in maintaining the landscape. The Bears Ears original collaborative structure was a long overdue step towards formal inclusion of Native voices in land management planning. The monument honors traditional knowledge as a value to be protected and to be used in planning and in the day-to-day management of the monument. Utah politicians who opposed the designation quickly got to work on dismantling the monument and the collaborative management structure. The recognition and inclusion of Native traditional knowledge systems is needed because it is nature-based. And it is an essential part of the collective knowledge base as it connects the processes and outcomes more closely to community. Native peoples have found effective holistic solutions from generations of living with the natural world, and it is imbued in our traditional environmental knowledge and overall lifeways. Immediately after Trump took office, Utah officials and others began lobbying against the national monuments that President Obama designated. In 2017, after almost a year of intense lobbying, led by former Senator Orrin Hatch, Trump revoked and replaced Bears Ears, cutting it by 85% and reduced Grand Staircase-Escalante by almost half on the same day. Trump's proclamations also reduced the scope of the Tribal Management Commission by restricting their authority to just one of the two shrunken units, the Southern Shasta unit. To top it off, Trump's proclamation added a county official to the body, diluting the collaborative management structure and dishonoring the government-to-government relationship between tribes and the U.S. government, the sovereign-to-sovereign relationship. Counties are not sovereigns, and the inclusion of a lower-level official disrespects the intent of the original Bears Ears collaborative management model. These actions represent the single largest removal of protections for public lands in American history. The massive reduction to Bears Ears was an absolute and gross disregard to tribes who fought for years to have it designated. In response, the 5 tribes, non-governmental organizations, and outdoor businesses worked together to file litigation, challenging the unlawful revocation and replacement of Bears Ears. Similarly, right next door, other non-governmental organizations and science organizations were filing litigation challenging the cuts to Grand Staircase. The cases are ready for oral arguments or decision. As part of the dismantling of the collaborative management structure, The Bureau of Land Management immediately began writing new monument management plans for the shrunken units without adequate tribal consultation. The rushed planning process ignored public comment in favor of protecting the monument and resulted with a plan for Bears Ears that had weaker protections, as if no monument had even been designated. A monument advisory committee was also created and was stacked with monument opponents. The two slots open for Indigenous representation were occupied by Navajo monument opponents, just disregarding intertribal unity. The final records of decisions, or RODs, for the 15% of lands remaining in Bears Ears after the Trump cuts, for the entirety of Grand Staircase-Escalante was released in February. The plans approve inappropriate public promotion of sensitive cultural areas, destructive pinyon juniper deforestation, new off-road vehicle use, increased allowable group sizes at Bears Ears, and no requirement to pack out human waste. The plan fails to meet the minimum requirements under the law for how national monuments must be managed. Lands cut from both monuments are now open to new coal and oil and gas leasing, though no leases have yet been met, and to new claims for minerals like uranium. The 5 tribes refused to participate in the Bureau of Land Management's planning for Trump's monument units and began planning their own process. In December 2019, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition announced to the public that it had undertaken a management plan for the originally proposed full 1.9 million acre footprint that would employ traditional knowledge and Western methods. It is scheduled to be completed in 2021. Traditional knowledge needs to be included in land management, and tribes need to be involved in the decision-making processes related to cultural landscapes, from the identification, the description of the cultural values, to the nomination, implementation, education, and long-term outcomes. Traditional knowledge allows an integrative approach to stewardship by maintaining stable relationships with the natural world. It is important to recognize how results differ between consultation and real involvement with Native peoples. When we listen to the concerns, values, needs, aspirations, and priorities of Native communities, there is ample potential to build bridges and shape robust working partnerships that are authentic, equitable, and inclusive. The land that spans between Bears Ears, Canyons of the Ancients, and the Hovenweep monuments is significant to Pueblos, Diné, Ute, and Paiute peoples, and connects Chaco, Canyon, Mesa Verde, and Bears Ears and beyond. This area has the highest cultural density in the United States, more than Bears Ears, and 80% of it is open for oil and gas leasing, which could easily be set up for single use. In this case, that would be energy development. It is the last significant gap of protected areas between Zion and Mesa Verde. This is an opportunity for tribes to take the lead and reestablish significant connections to this particular cultural landscape. With so much happening in the world today with climate change, Native peoples know through the prophecies of our ancestors that we have a duty to protect the natural world in all of our relations. As we move forward, we will continue to work with tribes and other NGO partners and members of Congress on new federal legislation to ensure federal and intertribal collaborative management on public lands, and to expand, export, and strengthen the Bears Ears model. And with that, we would like to wrap our presentation. Excuse me. Thank you all for attending this evening. We look forward to having you with us over the next few weeks. We will be having our series will be every Thursday throughout the month of October. Please help us welcome our Native experts. And if you would like more information, please visit our websites, Grand Canyon Trust or the Grand Staircase-Escalante Partners. We have the list of panelists, and for the future series, we will have more panelists listed there as well. Thank you all so much, and take care.
Thanks, everybody, and take good care.